Good morning and welcome to the Point. This past week on Mackinac Island, the Detroit Regional Chamber had their annual policy conference. It draws thousands of decision makers from around the state, including a fair number of politicians. There were a lot of interesting topics discussed, like how to create more jobs and how to train people for the jobs that exist now. We also heard discussions about funding infrastructure, particularly for cities. We sat down with two of our federal lawmakers to take a broader look at some of the issues they were interested in here on Mackinac, starting with U.S. Senator Gary Peters. Senator, I've been coming to this conference for, a couple of decades, and it occurs to me that increasingly this really does become a more collaborative effort with people really exchanging ideas. Yeah, there's plenty of politics mixed in, but
sure.
But it really does seem like you and some of your colleagues are here and talking about those things where there can be some common ground. Is that just my perception, or is that the way that it works?
No, I think it's reality. In fact, and we have to have common ground. We got to come together, Democrats, Republicans, we have to come together to do what's best for the state. And this is a way to do that in a very informal way. And you get to know people on a personal level, which is very important. And it's also about having collaboration with the business community, other folks who are involved in trying to deal with some of the issues that we're facing as a state. And when you can all be in under one roof and having those kinds of conversations, that's how things happen.
And one of the things that people are talking about increasingly is what I see as kind of the resurgence, the remaking of the automobile industry, the mobility industry. I know it's something you've been very interested in when it comes particularly to smart cars, interactive cars, interconnected cars. But one of your other interests is the military industrial foundation in the state of Michigan. Now those two things are kind of coming together in one of the initiatives you're working on.
Well, they do come together. And I think it's important to step back to realize that a lot of where we're going with autonomous vehicles really started at the military side. It was the Department of Defense, it was DARPA grants, which did research in autonomy. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. If you can automate functions, you can save people's lives. This is about warfighters' lives. And when you think about Michigan and the work that we're doing with vehicles, ground vehicles, which is done out of Tardac, a lot of this work in Warren, is that they were doing research into autonomy because if you look at casualties, in the Iraq War is an example, we had more soldiers and Marines who died in logistics operations than actually in combat. And that's because it's pretty dangerous to drive a fuel truck out to the front line to fuel the tanks. You're a huge target and a pretty explosive target at that. And so if you can take a driver out, you can save lives. So that kind of work now also translates into the civilian world and with automobiles, and it'll also save lives. Self-driving cars, and even before we get there, these new technologies will make cars safer. You'll be able to deal with distracted driving, other kinds of human errors that lead to accidents. And when you think about the fact that 40,000 people die on our highways every year, that's a big deal. We can save thousands of lives.
We've talked a lot about this, but it bears repeating when, and admittedly I'm a car guy, so I get kind of excited about this, but when you go to places like M-City, or when you take a look at the new expansion that's going to happen over at Willow Run, when you look at those kind of things, how much of a leg up does that give Michigan if we have the places where you can test the technology? How much more likely is it that technology will be developed here?
It's a big deal, and that's why I certainly worked very hard to make sure that Willow Run was designated a national facility early before the new administration came in. Regardless of who the administration was, we needed speed is critical. And we're facing some pretty tough competition globally, but also here in this country. We've got Silicon Valley that wants to be the leader. We've got Pittsburgh that wants to be the leader. I think we have a competitive advantage in the fact that we already have a lot of automotive research that's done in Michigan from not only the big three, but Toyota in Ann Arbor, Nissan in Farmington Hills, Honda just across the border in Ohio. Those other areas don't have that. In fact, when I was out in Silicon Valley recently meeting with some of these tech companies, one of them was very candid with me, which I enjoyed. They said, we thought about not only doing the computer technology, but also building cars too, until we went to Detroit and we went to some auto plants and we realized that's a pretty complicated business. Maybe we should let the auto companies do that and let's partner with them. And that's why we're seeing Google now coming into Michigan. You've got NVIDIA, you've got Microsoft. I was with Cisco recently. They're going to increase their employment in Michigan. This is the place to be. This is going to be the hub for autos. And then the exciting thing is that also means this will be the hub for artificial intelligence, which is the next big thing.
How did we get here? 10 years ago, if we were sitting on this porch, people were saying the automobile industry is not coming back. We've lost thousands and thousands of jobs. People are moving out of this state, and the mood about the state was gloomier than the weather is this morning as we sit here. Now, 10 years later, we're talking about this resurgent auto industry, the mobility industry, as the governor has spoken of it, as you have too, because it's more than just cars, obviously, and it's more than just vehicles. How did that turnaround happen in 10 years?
Well, we had to get through a very tough time, and I was through that tough time, and the economy was collapsing, and people weren't buying automobiles, and we could have came very close to losing two major manufacturers. So after getting through that, we always knew, though, if you bet on American workers, you bet on American ingenuity, you're going to succeed. And I think the auto industry is a classic story that there was a stumble, but it was a lot of factors well beyond the auto industry. This is the whole economy. This is about what we saw was kind of unbridled greed on Wall Street that brought our economy to its knees, and it could have taken down a big part of the American auto industry with it, but luckily that did not happen. And then you put it back in the hands of great workers and great engineers from America, and we succeed.
Let's talk a little bit about the military component of this. As we said, they're interconnected, but you have for a number of years been talking about the base of manufacturing in this state as it pertains to military. Everything from, and I've referenced this before, to your tour last summer of a manufacturing company that makes boots and other footwear for our military men and women. But when you were talking about Warren, I couldn't help but think, if you went back to World War II, they were a hotbed of military industrialization then too. So it isn't new, but it is kind of resurgent because we're building everything from these smart vehicles to launch components for the Mars mission that's coming up. So how big is that in Michigan?
Well, it's very big, and we got to keep it in Michigan, as you said, from boots to make sure the folks that are warfighters, the material that they're wearing is made in America by American workers. I think it's a question of national security. We should actually make these things in our country. And actually, I'm very worried, and I've been working as a member of the Armed Services Committee and raising a lot of issues related to Chinese investment in some critical infrastructure in terms of manufacturing infrastructure in this country. I mean, we have to hold on to this technology. We have a technological advantage, which is important for us from an economic standpoint, but also from a military standpoint. They go hand in glove together. And we're seeing concerted efforts from other countries to buy into American companies with a primary purpose, I believe, is to have access to some of this technology that is right now world class. And so I don't think we can ever separate the two. National security and economic security go hand in glove, and we need to be thinking about manufacturing policies that protect American workers and protect the lead that we have now.
We have spent the bulk of this interview talking about policy. This is the Detroit Chamber's policy conference, but I would be remiss if I don't ask you about Washington and what the general overall impression is there now. The first quarter out of the way, the first 120 some days of the presidency in place. How are things moving, if they are moving, in Washington?
Well, I would hope they would move quicker. We have to deal with a whole variety of very serious issues, and unfortunately the whole issue related to Russia and possible involvement in the campaign is a real cloud, and it seems the cloud keeps being put in the air every time a new tweet comes out from the president. So I was pleased that there has now been a special counsel appointed to get to the bottom of this. We just have to get to the facts. Hopefully we can do that as quickly as possible in an unbiased, non-political way, have the FBI do what they do very well, which is just pursue the facts and be aggressive in doing that. The integrity of the FBI is critically important. It's really a cornerstone institution for our democracy, that people have to believe that the rule of law is supreme in this country, and we expect the FBI to follow that and to be able to provide us facts. And that's where we should let this go now. And if the facts lead to clearing the president, that's fine. If they lead to something else, then we have to deal with that. But let's get it behind us and as quickly as possible so we can get on with the work for the American people.
Some of the initiatives that you've undertaken are bipartisan efforts. You're working with some of your Republican counterparts. Is that bipartisanship, while we don't always see it, but is that bipartisanship put in danger because of these other conversations? Does that put a strain on relationships between you and Republican colleagues?
Well, it can, but I think we can still work together bipartisan. I mean, I'm working on self-driving vehicle legislation with Senator Thune, who is the Republican chair of the Commerce Committee. We've had a real good working relationship. I just recently passed the American Innovation Act with a Republican from Colorado, Cory Gardner, who I consider a friend, not just a colleague. And so we can still work together. And But having a cloud that distracts us from working on that because we have to be dealing with whatever fire seems to arise that week in Washington is not helpful. And it takes us both off of our track and our ability to find common ground and to get things done.
There was a good deal of conversation about bipartisan cooperation on Mackinac Island this past week. A lot of it did center around the Soo Locks, a big infrastructure project where a number of the congressional delegation from Michigan toured on Friday. When we come back, we'll talk more with U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow about that. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. The Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference on Mackinac Island draws people from all over the state of Michigan. More than a few of those are politicians. We sat down to talk with U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow, who is now the senior senator from the state. She talked about why conferences like this are important and why she thinks it's important to get the entire delegation from Michigan together to talk about issues of common interest. Senator, we find ourselves looking out at rather gloomy, but still picturesque.
Still beautiful.
It is still beautiful.
Yeah,
the Great Lakes. I know this is something
Yeah.
you and I have talked about for years, but in the past
Right.
few weeks, it's become a little more pointed because you're concerned about the potential of $300 million out of the
Right.
federal budget for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that the president's budget leaves out. I know you and Republican counterparts
Yes,
are trying to get
absolutely.
it back in. And I know you've got until fall. It's going to be a long conversation. But talk to me from your standpoint the importance of that money.
Well, first of all, 40 million people get their drinking water from the Great Lakes. And in addition to that, we know about hunting and boating and fishing and what this means. Economy, tens of thousands of jobs related to the Great Lakes, farming. I mean, it's really our way of life, and it's a precious national resource. And I stress that because the budget director has said this is something that we should just care about locally in Michigan. In fact, Canada cares about it. They're part of the coalition with the United States, 8 states. And this is an incredible national resource, 20% of the world's fresh water. So we have a stake in it. And I'm very concerned because even after you and I have talked about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, looking further in the budget, it's even worse because we found out that the voluntary conservation efforts we put in the Farm Bill that involve working with farmers on runoff into the Great Lakes and water quality, they zeroed those out too. And so everywhere we look, the efforts that we've been using to clean up the beaches, to clean up the water, to stop the Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes, to deal with zebra mussels, they zero out all of it, which makes no sense to me. And it's really a slap in the face to the Great Lakes states.
It's hard to assign motivation, but give me a guess. I mean, are they doing this because they think it is unimportant, or is this just the broad strokes that they're trying to use to readjust their priorities and spending?
Well, they clearly have a different set of priorities. They think that everything ought to be done at the state and local level. So it doesn't matter if it's providing health care, if it's protecting water, roads. They don't really see. I've heard a lot of discussions about whether or not we should do roads locally. And I said, well, what should we each pave the road in front of our house? I mean, there's some things that you do collectively, both, not just locally, but state, federal government, so that we can have an interstate highway system where we can protect our water, or our farmers who are all across the country growing the food that we eat, or every other effort that we do collectively on water and air and food and transportation and so on. So I think there's a philosophy that is pervasive right now at the new administration that they just they don't think those things are important for the federal government to do.
I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but as I listen to you talk, there is a pretty good division between some of the priorities that you and some of your Democratic colleagues might champion and what we've seen come forward from the administration. We know the struggle that it's been to
Right.
get a budget
Right.
done in Washington. Are we headed, I know we can't predict, are we headed to another time where we have another continuing resolution? Because it seems to me that on each page there is one more difficult hurdle to cross.
I hope not, but that could be what's happening. I do know there's bipartisan concern, certainly about the Great Lakes, about efforts. They cut the Farm Bill so much that, Rick, we wouldn't be able to write the next 5-year farm bill next year, because they proposed cutting over $230 billion out of support for farmers. And I know that Senator Pat Roberts and I both share a concern about that. So I see elements where people are saying this makes absolutely no sense when you look at the economy, the quality of life for our country, and so on. But we could very well end up in a stalemate where we see a continuation budget. Given what they've proposed, frankly, that might be the best thing, given the fact that what they're suggesting is really draconian cuts in our quality of life and healthcare and how we make food and water quality and everything else. And I find it very insulting that what they want to do is take all that money and put it into another tax cuts for multimillionaires and billionaires on top. So most people will see their standard of living go down, their costs go up, except a very few people who already have had the most benefit out of the current economy.
Let's talk for a moment about the general attitude in Washington. And then I want to come back to what this conference is about, policy.
Sure.
But since we got to that jumping off point, give me your take. You've been in Washington long enough to know, with Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, what is the general mood with your colleagues? Is there a sense that you can work together and get things done in a bipartisan way, or does it feel like gridlock has set in?
Well, I always put my head down and work across the aisle. That's how we got the last farm bill. That's how we got money to help people Flint with their water system. That's how we've done a number of things, because I have colleagues, good friends, who are Republicans that we work with. And what I hear from them is great concern about this White House in a way that we've not seen maybe ever, in terms of a desire to keep the White House out of the negotiations so that members can find a way to work together and get things done. That happened on the short-term budget we just did, where members in the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, negotiated, I think, a good bill. And we're able to get that done. And the only time that we had some hiccups is when the new budget director tried to step in and change what the agreements were. And so I think there's an interest in sort of letting the House and Senate work together and try to get things done separate from the White House. And there's also great concern about what we are seeing in terms of the inability to stand up to Russia, who is very quickly becoming a very, very serious concern for us.
When you think about this conference, it's called the Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference.
Right.
But it really has become a statewide gathering
Yes,
for people
it is.
from all parts of Michigan
Right.
to work collaboratively. And one of the areas that we see that is in an initiative that you're participating in, where you will tour the Sioux Locks.
Right.
But you're going to do it, if I understand it, with Governor Snyder, with Congressman Upton, and a whole bunch of other House
Right.
members. I mean, you're going to have a quorum, at least of the Michigan lawmakers up there. Tell me how important a conference like this is to help facilitate something
Sure.
where you get really a bipartisan interest in something that a number of people have sounded the alarm about when it comes to the Sioux Locks.
Yes. Well, first let me say that a couple of years ago when I came in as senior senator, I really wanted to make a priority that our whole delegation, House, Senate, Republicans, Democrats, visiting places in Michigan where members could see something not in their district that would be important for them as we fight for Michigan. So we did all the defense installations a couple of years ago, and then decided that the Sioux Locks, which is top priority for the state and top priority for us in terms of building a second lock, so that if something happens to a very old lock, the pole locks, that we don't shut down commerce for the Great Lakes and the country. So we decided to, at the end of this conference, it would be a good time to have everybody go. We invited the governor. We're very pleased the governor and his administration will be there, and House and Senate members with the Army Corps of Engineers to look specifically at the locks, tour some of the areas where they're most concerned so we can see the vulnerabilities. What's called the pole lock is where 70% of the barges come in from the St. Lawrence Seaway. If that broke down, we would shut down manufacturing, agriculture, basically commerce, not only for the Great Lakes states, but for the country as well. So there's two smaller locks next to it that we would like to turn into a second large lock. So there would be two that could accommodate any size ship that was coming in. It will take years to do. It will cost money to do. We want to get it high up on the Army Corps' priority list. And Congressman Bergman, who represents the area, is joining me in introducing legislation to authorize the project. So we're trying to get everybody on board.
The interesting thing about that is that, again, it comes back to a multi-state effort.
Yes.
And it would be federal money, almost, well, perhaps not exclusively, but
Right.
largely federal
Largely.
money through the Corps and what have you. And again, that's got to be something that's viewed as a national
Yes.
interest, even though some people will look at it and say, well, that's at the very northern part of the United
Right.
States. How can that impact me?
Right. Well, when we talk about borders, I mean, national borders, we talk about what needs to happen in terms of border security and bridges and so on. Well, this is another kind of border security. This is the way ships enter the Great Lakes and go throughout the country and are delivering raw materials that are absolutely necessary. They're moving agricultural products and basically commerce, not only through the Great Lakes, but they go through the Great Lakes and then they are put on rail and sent throughout the country. So this is a critical piece of infrastructure for the country, and that's the message that we want to get out.
We have convened here on this porch for a long time, and a lot of times we talk about jobs, and for a long time we talked about lack of and how we were hemorrhaging jobs and people were leaving the state. You have a new jobs initiative, but it has a much more positive spin on it because now there are jobs.
There are jobs, and there's a couple of things I'm focused on, and this is something that I would like very much to work with the administration on, because for years I have been focused on closing tax loopholes that encourage jobs to go overseas. My Bring Jobs Home Act needs to get passed. We need to strengthen our Buy America provisions so that we're giving more opportunities for small businesses, startups to participate in federal purchasing as well. And then we've got to continue to get tough with China. I mean, the president said he was going to call China a currency manipulator. We understand they're about ready to do that again. He needs to call them out, and we need to work together on fair trade. The other piece that I'm very focused on, Rick, that I'm hearing about everywhere I go, including here at the conference, is the need to focus on workforce development. Everywhere I go, in all my small business visits, I'm hearing concerns about people trying to find the right people to fill jobs. And many of them are highly skilled building trades jobs. And so I think we've got to change the way we look at what a good job is or a career. It's not all four-year university. That's great for people, but others may want to do a 4 or 5 year apprentice and come out with a great high-skilled job and no debt, by the way, going that direction, or a community college where they're getting a skill maybe in nursing or where they're getting another computer technology skill. We need all of those things, and we have great opportunities for people, but we need to get people focused on advanced manufacturing and highly skilled trades, building trades jobs that are open today, that pay well, and our employers are really clamoring for people.
You can see my story of the delegation tour of the Sioux Locks by going to woodtv.com. Our thanks to Senator Stabenow and Senator Peters for being our guests this morning. And when we come back, we'll have more To the Point. So another year of the Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference in the books. We heard a lot of conversation here on the island about infrastructure, about jobs, finding new ones and finding people to fill the existing ones, about education, and of course about some politics too. But mostly we heard people trying to find common solutions for problems around the state. That's why we continue to come here to see what decision makers are talking about. That's why we bring it to you. As we do every week, with the exception of next week, we're preempted because of NBC programming. We'll see you back here in 2 weeks on To the Point.